Picture a village somewhere in the Fertile Crescent. The time is approximately 9,000 years ago. The settlement is small by modern standards, maybe 200 or 300 people living in mud brick structures clustered around shared storage facilities, surrounded by fields of emmer wheat and einkorn that the community has been cultivating and refining for several generations now. From the outside, and from the perspective of that moment in time, this place looks like progress. The people here are not starving. They have food stored in granaries that insulates them from the immediate terror of a failed hunt or an unproductive foraging day. They have permanent structures instead of temporary camps. They have the beginnings of the social organization and resource concentration that will eventually produce cities, writing, metallurgy, and everything built on top of those foundations. But look at the bones. Not metaphorically, literally look at the bones. When bioarchaeologists excavate the cemeteries of early agricultural settlements and compare the skeletal remains to those of the hunter-gatherer populations that preceded or coexisted with them in the same regions, the comparison is startling and consistent across site after site, region after region, continent after continent. The farmers are shorter. Their bones show more developmental stress. Their teeth carry more decay and more enamel defects indicating childhood nutritional disruption. Their skeletons show higher rates of infectious disease, higher rates of anemia, higher rates of the kind of chronic physical strain that comes from performing the same repetitive movements day after day for years. Their average lifespan, controlling for the very high infant mortality that affects both populations, is not dramatically longer than their hunter-gatherer contemporaries, and in many documented cases is shorter. The people in that village made what is arguably the deadliest mistake in the entire history of the human species. And they had absolutely no idea they were making it. They thought they were solving a problem. They were, in fact, creating several much larger ones that would compound across thousands of years in ways that nobody could have predicted from inside the moment of decision. This is the story of agriculture. The development that most people were taught to understand as one of humanity's greatest achievements, reframed through the lens of what it actually cost the people who adopted it, what cascading consequences it set in motion that are still running today, and why understanding it as a mistake, or at least as a catastrophically double-edged bargain, is more accurate than the triumphalist narrative that most of us absorbed in school. Start with what ancient humans were giving up when they transitioned to agriculture, because the standard narrative skips past this with embarrassing speed. The standard narrative says, hunter-gatherers were struggling, barely surviving, living in constant terror of starvation, and agriculture rescued them by providing reliable food and the stability that made civilization possible. This narrative is wrong in almost every particular, and the wrongness matters enormously for understanding what was actually lost. Hunter-gatherers, under most ecological conditions and for most of human prehistory, were not on the edge of starvation. The studies conducted on 20th century hunter-gatherer groups, the San people of the Kalahari being the most extensively studied, found that adults in these communities typically spent somewhere between 15 and 20 hours per week acquiring food. Not per day, per week. The remaining time was available for rest, social interaction, storytelling, craft, and what can only be described as leisure by any reasonable definition. The work of subsistence in a hunter-gatherer lifestyle is spread across varied activities. Different types of hunting, gathering different plant foods, fishing, processing, that use the body differently and prevent the cumulative repetitive strain that agricultural labor produces. The hunter-gatherer diet was extraordinarily diverse. Access to dozens of different animal species, hundreds of different plant species across seasonal cycles, fungi, insects, eggs, honey, shellfish, and whatever the local ecology provided created a nutritional profile that no agricultural diet could match. The nutritional breadth of hunter-gatherer diets was so wide that specific micronutrient deficiencies were essentially unknown. The body's requirements for zinc, iron, calcium, B vitamins, vitamin C, and every other nutrient were met through sheer dietary diversity rather than through any specific food's exceptional nutritional profile. This nutritional reality is visible in the bones and teeth. Paleolithic hunter-gatherer skeletal remains, across the vast majority of examined populations, show lower rates of dental caries, lower rates of enamel hypoplasia, lower rates of skeletal markers of nutritional deficiency, and greater average stature than the agricultural populations that replaced them. The physical condition of the human body was better, on average, during the period of hunting and gathering than it was during the early agricultural period that followed. So why did agriculture happen? Why did people adopt a strategy that was, by the skeletal evidence, making them shorter, sicker, and working harder for worse nutritional outcomes? The answer requires understanding the specific ecological conditions of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, roughly 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, when wild food abundance was declining in many regions. The end of the last ice age brought climate changes that restructured ecosystems across the northern hemisphere. The megafauna that had been the foundation of Paleolithic subsistence, woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths, ancient horses and camels in the Americas, were going extinct, partly from climate-driven habitat change and partly from the sustained hunting pressure of expanding human populations. The rich, reliable, high-calorie megafaunal resource base that had supported large human populations during the Paleolithic was contracting. At the same time, human populations themselves had been growing. The Paleolithic was not a static period. Human populations expanded across the planet, moved into new environments, and grew in numbers over tens of thousands of years. As populations grew and wild resources contracted, the comfortable ratio of available food to people that had made the 20 hours per week hunting and gathering lifestyle possible was tightening. The ecological margin was shrinking. In this context, the intensification of plant food production through deliberate cultivation made sense as a response to a resource problem, not an immediate crisis. Agriculture did not appear in a single generation of starving people desperate for a solution. It was a gradual process of increasing reliance on manageable, predictable plant foods in areas where they grew well, combined with gradually developing techniques for improving yields through selective cultivation over many generations. But the logic that made agriculture make sense as a response to population pressure and wild food contraction contained a fundamental trap that was invisible from inside the decision. Agriculture does not simply solve the problem of supporting more people on available land. Agriculture expands the number of people that available land can support, which drives population growth, which requires more agricultural intensification to support the larger population, which supports even more population growth in a self-reinforcing cycle with no natural ceiling except ecological collapse. This is the demographic trap at the heart of the agricultural transition. Hunter-gatherer populations were regulated by the carrying capacity of the landscape under hunter-gatherer subsistence, a natural equilibrium that was uncomfortable and sometimes catastrophically disrupted, but that maintained a long-term balance between people and resources. Agriculture raised the ceiling of that carrying capacity, and human populations responded by growing to fill the new ceiling, and then growing past it, requiring further agricultural intensification in a cycle that has been running continuously for 10,000 years. The health consequences that emerged from this cycle were not accidental or incidental to agriculture. They were structural features of what agriculture does to human nutrition, human disease ecology, and human bodies under conditions of labor intensification. The nutritional collapse that accompanied agricultural transition is documented across every region where the archaeological record is sufficient to trace it. The shift from diverse hunter-gatherer diets to grain-dominated agricultural diets produced specific, predictable nutritional deficiencies. Grains are excellent caloric sources, dense in starch, reliably productive, storable over long periods. They are poor sources of complete protein, deficient in several key vitamins and minerals, and high in compounds like phytic acid that bind dietary minerals and reduce their absorption. A diet dominated by wheat, barley, rice, or maize can keep a person alive, and even active, but it cannot provide the nutritional completeness that diverse wild food diets provided. Iron deficiency anemia became endemic in agricultural populations in ways it had not been in hunter-gatherer populations. Grain-dominated diets provide iron in non-heme form, which is substantially less bioavailable than the heme iron in meat, and the phytic acid in grains further reduces iron absorption. The skeletal signature of iron deficiency anemia, a condition called porotic hyperostosis, visible as characteristic porosity in specific skull locations, appears at dramatically higher rates in early agricultural populations than in preceding hunter-gatherer populations from the same regions. Zinc deficiency emerged from similar mechanisms, producing consequences for immune function, wound healing, reproductive health, and growth that compounded the other nutritional problems of agricultural diets. Vitamin C deficiency, while not universally documented, appears at higher rates in populations with limited access to the diverse plant foods that hunter-gatherer diets provided abundantly. The comprehensive nutritional sufficiency of hunter-gatherer diets was replaced by the caloric sufficiency but nutritional narrowness of agricultural diets, and the population-level health consequences were measurable and substantial. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The physical workload of agricultural subsistence was a different kind of cost. Plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, threshing, grinding, irrigation maintenance, animal management. Agricultural labor is not simply more work than foraging. It is more monotonous work, performed repeatedly in the same body positions using the same muscle groups, producing the cumulative strain injuries and joint degeneration that characterize agricultural skeletal assemblages. The grinding of grain by hand, performed primarily by women in most ancient agricultural societies, produced characteristic arthritic changes in the joints of the hands, wrists, elbows, and spine that are so consistent across early agricultural sites that bioarchaeologists use them as diagnostic markers of agricultural status. The occupational health of early farmers was, by skeletal evidence, worse than the occupational health of hunter-gatherers. The variety of physical activities that hunter-gatherer subsistence required, different movement patterns for different food acquisition strategies, walking over varied terrain, climbing, swimming, carrying, produced bodies that were robustly adapted to physical challenge without showing the specific joint wear and repetitive strain signatures of agricultural labor. The farmer's body bore the marks of a narrower, more repetitive, more mechanically demanding form of physical work. The disease ecology transformation of the agricultural transition is where the consequences become most catastrophic and most far-reaching. This is the element of the agricultural mistake that has killed more human beings than any other single factor in history, and it is the element most thoroughly absent from the triumphalist narrative of agricultural progress. Dense, sedentary, agricultural populations living near their own waste and near their domestic animals created the epidemiological conditions for the emergence and sustained transmission of a category of infectious disease that simply could not exist in mobile hunter-gatherer populations. The epidemic crowd diseases, smallpox, measles, typhoid, cholera, bubonic plague, and dozens of others, require large, dense, continuously replenished susceptible populations to maintain transmission chains. Mobile forager bands of 20 to 50 people cannot sustain epidemic disease transmission. When a pathogen infects a small band, it runs through the available susceptible individuals rapidly, either burning itself out when it has no more susceptible hosts or killing everyone present. Either outcome extinguishes the transmission chain. Epidemic disease requires a city, or at minimum a large, dense, sedentary population, to become the sustained endemic. Disaster it became in agricultural civilizations. The zoonotic origins of most of these epidemic diseases trace directly to the animal domestication that accompanied agricultural development. Measles derived from rinderpest, a cattle disease. Smallpox from a pox virus of rodents or cattle. Influenza from birds and pigs. Tuberculosis from cattle. The close sustained contact between humans and domestic animals in agricultural settlements, living in proximity, sharing spaces, handling animal waste, consuming animal products, created repeated opportunities for animal pathogens to make the cross-species jump into human populations. Once jumped in dense agricultural populations, these pathogens found the epidemiological conditions they needed to establish sustained human-to-human transmission chains and become permanent features of human disease ecology. The mortality these diseases caused across agricultural civilizations is beyond precise quantification, but was enormous. The plagues that ravaged ancient cities, Athens, Rome, the pandemic Justinian plague of the 6th century CE, the Black Death of the 14th century, were products of the agricultural and urban density that farming had enabled. The Antonine Plague may have killed 5 million people. The Justinian plague, perhaps 25 to 50 million. The Black Death, somewhere between 75 and 200 million. These numbers, staggering as they are, represent only the documented catastrophic outbreaks. The background mortality from endemic infectious disease in agricultural populations was a continuous elevated drain on population health that no hunter-gatherer group ever experienced at comparable scale. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, isolated from the Eurasian disease pool for approximately 15,000 years, provide the most horrifying demonstration of what epidemic crowd disease could do to populations that lacked accumulated immunity. When European contact introduced smallpox, measles, typhoid, and other Eurasian agricultural diseases to populations with no immunological experience of these pathogens, the demographic collapse that followed may have reduced indigenous American populations by 70 to 90% within a century or two of initial contact. The scale of this mortality, tens of millions of people, is attributable directly to the disease ecology that 10,000 years of Eurasian agricultural and urban civilization had created, concentrated, and exported through exploration and trade. The social and political consequences of agricultural surplus represent another dimension of the agricultural mistake that compounds over time. Surplus is the precondition for everything that human civilization has built. For cities, for writing, for metallurgy, for art, for philosophy, for science. But surplus is also the precondition for everything human civilization has suffered that hunter-gatherer societies did not. You cannot have institutionalized violence at scale without surplus. You cannot have slavery without surplus. You cannot have hereditary aristocracy without surplus. You cannot have organized warfare between states without surplus. Hunter-gatherer conflict exists and can be lethal. The evidence for interpersonal violence in Paleolithic populations is real, but the scale, organization, and sustained lethality of warfare between agricultural states has no Paleolithic parallel. Armies require food supplies. Sieges require storable surplus to sustain either the besieging or besieged force. The conquest of agricultural civilizations by other agricultural civilizations, the subjugation of agricultural populations by elite minorities controlling surplus access, the institution of slavery as a mechanism for directing surplus production. None of these are conceivable in mobile forager societies where the material basis for sustained, organized violence and elite resource control does not exist. The institution of slavery, which has affected hundreds of millions of human beings across the entire span of recorded history, is an agricultural institution. It exists because agriculture creates forms of productive labor, field work, mine work, construction of monuments and infrastructure that surplus-holding elites can extract from coerced populations. Forager societies have status hierarchies and sometimes captured individuals from other groups, but they did not develop chattel slavery as an institution because the economic conditions that make chattel slavery profitable, large-scale organized productive labor generating extractable surplus, did not exist. The environmental consequences of agricultural expansion added a further dimension of harm that operated at geological rather than individual timescales. Deforestation to create agricultural land, soil depletion through repeated cultivation without adequate nutrient replacement, salinization of irrigated land, erosion of topsoil, and the extinction of species driven out of converted habitats. All of these began with the first agricultural expansions and have accelerated continuously since. The ancient civilizations whose agricultural expansion created the most productive food systems often also created the conditions for their own eventual collapse through environmental degradation. The Mesopotamian agricultural system, dependent on irrigation from the Tigris and Euphrates, progressively salinized its irrigated soils through the accumulation of mineral salts left behind as irrigation water evaporated. Salinization reduced yields, required expansion of cultivation to new areas, produced more salinization, and ultimately contributed to the decline of agricultural productivity in regions that had been the most productive farmland in the ancient world. The ruins of Mesopotamian cities sit in landscapes that were once fertile and are now largely degraded. A physical record of what long-term agricultural exploitation without sustainable management does to the land it depends on. The ancient Maya agricultural system, supporting populations in tropical lowland environments whose soils were not naturally suited to intensive cultivation, collapsed partly through the cumulative effects of deforestation, soil erosion, and the climate feedbacks that large-scale forest removal produced. The sophisticated Maya civilization that built Tikal and Copan and Palenque disappeared from its peak centers in the Classic period collapse, partly because the agricultural foundation it had built was not sustainable at the intensity the population required. These are not isolated examples. They are instances of a pattern that repeats across agricultural civilizations with the regularity of a natural law. Intensive agriculture degrades the environments it depends on, requiring expansion to new areas or intensification that further accelerates degradation, until the system encounters a limit it cannot push past. None of which means agriculture was avoidable. Given the ecological pressures that drove its adoption, given the population dynamics that made its continuation self-reinforcing once begun, given the competitive advantages that agricultural surplus gave to agricultural societies in conflicts with hunter-gatherer societies. The transition was probably inevitable once the conditions that precipitated it were in place. The people in that Fertile Crescent village were not making a free choice from an unlimited menu of options. They were responding rationally to specific pressures with the tools and knowledge available to them, without any way of anticipating the cascading consequences that their rational response would set in motion. But the consequences were real. The shorter stature, the rotting teeth, the iron deficiency anemia, the repetitive strain injuries, the epidemic diseases, the institutionalized violence, the slavery, the environmental degradation. These are the archaeological and historical record of what the agricultural transition actually produced for the human bodies and human lives that lived through it. The deadliest mistake ancient humans ever made was not a mistake in the sense of an obviously wrong choice that a rational person would have avoided. It was a mistake in the sense of a decision whose full consequences were invisible at the time and could not have been predicted from inside the moment of decision. A solution to one problem that created a dozen larger problems. A trade that looked favorable in the short term and proved catastrophic in the long term. The people in that village were not foolish. They were human. And the thing about being human is that the consequences of our decisions tend to operate on timescales longer than any individual human life, in systems more complex than any individual human mind can fully model, producing outcomes that no decision maker could have anticipated. 10,000 years later, we are still living with the consequences of that decision, and in many respects, we are still making the same kind of trade.